And now we move forward with the next panel. It's called Country's DNA of Inclusion. And for this panel, I would like to invite on stage His Excellency Federico Salas Lotfe, who's the Ambassador of Mexico in India. Aly-Khan Rajani, who's the Head of Advocacy and Public Affairs at the High Commission of Canada to India. And Varun, Khanna, who will be moderating the session. And he's in charge of international partnerships and outreach at Pride Circle. I would request the panel to stick to the time limit because we'll have to break for lunch shortly.
Hello there. Thank you for staying with us all day today. I would say this is the best panel because I'm on it with two lovely people. Here we have His Excellency, the Ambassador of Mexico to India, who has joined us to tell a bit about Mexico. And we also have the Head of Advocacy from the Canadian High Commission. Would you like to introduce yourself briefly? So you work with the embassy on advocacy issues. What is your role with the embassy? Just
Sure.
very briefly.
My role at the Canadian High Commission involves ultimately championing a series of issues that Canada can put forward in India and work together with India. Shared values often where we can boost and support organizations. So the three areas that we focus on overall are gender equality, LGBTI rights, and environment and climate change. These are all under the larger sort of framework of promoting as much as we can inclusion, pluralism, diversity as a strength, and really nothing more and never as a weakness, but in fact together when we're able to foster those values, Canadian values, which are shared in India, and promote those through organizations, especially and many partners that are local and national, we can do much more and better.
What about you, sir?
Thank you. Well, as ambassador, I guess I deal with many things across the board, but in this specific issue, I think one of the things that we try to do is also kind of share the best practices that we have had in Mexico and where we are right now, where we have come. And so whoever wants to listen can probably learn from what we have achieved in terms of inclusion and respect of human rights and tolerance and all these kind of things.
So this is something I want to focus on because it was never criminalized in Mexico to be homosexual, and gay sex was not criminalized either. And yet, over the years, it has made great progress, probably because of that. Could you reflect a bit on that sort of inclusion journey that Mexico has gone through today to have same-sex marriage?
That is true. It was never criminalized, but it was. But nevertheless, we came from a society that is basically very conservative, largely a Catholic country, and therefore the church has an enormous influence and a conservative influence, and we all know what the Catholic Church stance on these issues has been, even though there has been some evolution in the recent past. So it was, while not being criminalized, and there were some outstanding cases of role models that were out there in the media, of intellectuals, artists, even politicians, nevertheless, it was sort of a taboo issue. And all of that started changing very rapidly. I think in parallel line with many changes that Mexico was experiencing, in a further reaffirmation of human rights, inclusion not only for sexual minorities, but other minorities of different types, people who are handicapped, etc., women certainly, the empowerment of women, and it was political leadership of some brave politicians who took stances to promote the rights of minorities, such as
we were talking about this earlier because I was very interested in who were the drivers of this change. And you would say it's the politicians. And what do you think enabled these politicians to drive that change?
Well, I think it was a political equation. I think the drive for human rights and inclusion and tolerance was always something that was coming, in the sense, in the political spectrum, coming from the left. And there were politicians who had, at that point, achieved prominent positions. For example, our present foreign minister, who was at the time mayor of Mexico City, and he is a man of the left, who decided to push for these rights as a way also to contrast with the more conservative and religious right. So it was basically a lot of his drive that, together, of course, with the support and certain mobilization of society, but it was largely his proactiveness that got us where we are.
So he was a change maker in a way. What about Canada? Obviously, Canada is known in India as being, you know, fairly liberal, very left, you know, in the East in terms at least. But that's not always been the case. This has been a journey. Could you reflect a bit on that, please?
It has been a journey, and I think the journey continues. It continues for India, it continues for Canada, and every country in the world. In our case, homosexuality was decriminalized 50 years ago, in 1969, now, you know, 51 years. And ultimately, you do look at that journey and realize that it took us 36 years to come to the conclusion as a country that we want to legalize and did legalize same-sex marriage. So just to put it into context, 36 years later, in a place that we look up to like Canada, is what it took. That's a fact. So I'm not saying that, you know, other countries will follow the same trajectory. Hopefully, when countries and communities want that change, whatever it is, and if it's same-sex marriage, then so be it, that hopefully time has passed. We're now in a world where you've got more technology, more sort of awareness, and frankly, evolution and understanding that if that change occurs, it could take less time, but the point is, it is a process. For us in Canada, you know, we've made other interesting changes that came again with a push from people and from politicians together. And I think it's very much also driven, as was said by the earlier panel and panelist, was a legal framework that actually enhances or guarantees the rights of people. In our case, it's the Canadian Human Rights Act. And that is, it is distinctly in there and defined. But keep in mind that, you know, in the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Canadian Criminal Code, it was only in 2016, which is just a few years ago, that gender identity and gender expression were actually included very clearly and distinctly there. So while we've made progress, and you know, it's great to be Canadian, and I take great pride in that, at the same time, it has been a journey that has taken time and has many steps involved to get where we are, and we're still not done either.
And this brings me to my next question. So what remains? Obviously, we've also seen the rise of intolerance around the world to a certain degree recently. So what remains to be done? Could you reflect a bit on that, perhaps?
Sure. I think, you know, where we've done well is where people have taken to heart, they've got a legal framework that supports them and backs them up, but ultimately it's an action and practice, right? So if we've got the private sector that actually not only actively recruits and engages people from the community, but ultimately creates an enabling environment when they're there. The policies and guidelines and procedures in the private sector, for example, are one piece that exist in some areas, but not necessarily in others. In fact, a great, you know, good news story, but again, to tell you that it's still going on, is the Canadian government just announced yesterday that we can use our pronouns as part of our formal signature blocks in our business cards without any pre-approval. This is a small, minor thing, and yet it's a huge thing. And that happened yesterday in Canada. So it just goes to tell you again that we still have work to do in the way of how we acknowledge any minority group. I mean, ultimately, we're talking about equal rights for all. And when we talk about it in a foreign policy context, Canada has actually defined and taken on a feminist foreign policy and a feminist international assistance policy, as has Mexico now, and some Nordic countries as well. And these are the kinds of changes that really address the nature of identity, who people are, and how they need to be treated regardless of who they are, where they come from, how they're defined, their sexuality, because ultimately there's a fundamental principle. There's a fundamental right that comes with being human. And that, as much as it's guaranteed in our Constitution, is it really in the hearts and minds? And I think it continues to be.
This is great you've brought it up, because my next question to you was, obviously Mexico has this very strong legal framework to protect LGBT people, whether that's through the provision of equal rights or marriage or anti-discrimination. But what about people? What about hearts and minds and the society? What's happening there? Because it's obviously as diverse.
Well, I think that that has changed a lot too. I think that certainly it's probably one case where the law went ahead of the change of hearts and minds of the people, but nevertheless, that has been happening. And you find today that there is a great deal of tolerance in Mexican society, even in conservative circles. The Catholic Church has kept very quiet about all of these things happening. There's the question of same-sex marriages and all sorts of policies against discrimination, tolerance, and inclusion of the LGBT community. And that is, for a society like the Mexican society, is a very big step. And there certainly has been, I think, many people at least are, if their hearts and minds are not one, or at least they are politically correct. They stay quiet about it. There are, of course, incidents of homophobia, violence that still take place in some parts of the country. But nonetheless, I think that, by and large, there is a general acceptance, and you see that a lot in, movies that are being made in Mexico. We talked about the telenovelas, the soap operas in Mexico. We always have nowadays some gay character. I mean, it has become very mainstream and is very well accepted.
That is very interesting, because we're just having a discussion about the Bollywood movie that has come out yesterday, and how that's also driving change, hopefully. What would you say about the drivers of change in Canada?
I mean, I think culture still is a huge one, right? When we can mainstream, and I hate to use the term, but just to illustrate the point, and make it normal and normalize to have, gay characters, trans characters, and that's not characters in a movie and TV shows. I mean, that's an easy entry point to have a conversation and influence mindset in society, because it's, these are followed by a cross-section of the population. But ultimately, are people included in the workplace, in social settings, in places where they can feel comfortable to socialize, let alone, in private spaces? One fundamental point that was brought up earlier that I want to reinforce, and one small example that, again, we are practicing in Canada in at least a few provinces, but even that can go national, is the idea of including a very clear set of, curricula, a school curriculum that actually addresses sexual orientation. So SOGI, for people that are familiar with it, from the World Bank, the Sexual Orientation and Gender Inclusion Toolkit is something that we have implemented in British Columbia and Alberta as part of the school curriculum. And that is a toolkit that actually goes through a series of different, chapters that ultimately give people the basis for understanding what are sexual, minorities in different groups and rights, and what do the definitions look like. We don't even understand sometimes what we're talking about. Even if we believe in it and have a legal framework to protect it, do we inherently and intrinsically understand what we mean by diversity and what we mean by pluralism? So the education is the first piece.
Yeah, I wanted to add something now that you mentioned the question of education in schools. One thing that was a change that was made last year in Mexico, for example, is that most of the kids that were going especially to public schools had to wear uniforms. Of course, the boys had pants, the girls had skirts. That has been changed. They can wear whatever they want. And it was also a very dramatic change in terms of the way people think about it, but it was widely accepted. So nowadays, if a girl wants to go to the school wearing pants, she can do that. If a boy wants to wear a skirt, I guess he can also do that. But that was, is this type of may seem minor, but they're very significant changes that are taking place and that are creating a wider acceptance of this ambience of tolerance.
Well, understanding queer histories in both these cases are very important, as India tries to reflect on what's happening in the West, in the outside world, and tries to bring back the best policies, the best ideas. My next question to you as foreign service workers in India is, what do you think is your role here? What are you able to address? What would you like to address? How are you able to address these issues here? So perhaps a bit of a reflection on that. Obviously, Canada is an important partner of Pride Circle, and we have your esteemed presence here. I think that says something to it. But perhaps if you could reflect a bit more on your role here.
I think in the context, especially of today, the idea of providing people skills and economic opportunities is key. So of course, fundamentally, we want awareness and we want acceptance and understanding. But past that, when we actually look at even the statistics of the value added of the pink economy, as it's called, and how much is lost in the billions of dollars, even in this country and many others, due to the stigma and discrimination and, frankly, a lack of access. So the first thing is getting people skilled up, and the second is providing them real opportunities, and the likes of a job fair is something we can easily support, and we're both here surely doing that today. In addition, our civil society is so fundamentally key to the movement moving forward in general. It's also important, though, that as international partners, we believe our role is not to set the agenda, but to empower the community to set the agenda, and then to back it up and support it. You tell us, what is it the international community can do to boost and to support you, what your agenda is, what your priorities are, where they line up with our values and interests and priorities. We will be there to support you, and we are there to support you. But that's the thing that we cannot possibly think that a Western country or any group of Western countries could set the agenda for India, and India surely doesn't need that. But it does mean the onus then becomes on civil society and the community, quote unquote, at large, which of course is not a homogeneous group, to decide what it needs, what it wants, and to tell us so we can come along with you.
What about you?
No, in our case, I mean, we don't have the type of resources that a country like Canada or other European countries have in terms of promoting that type of agenda. But nevertheless, we have actually a very clear instruction from the Foreign Ministry, not only here in India, I mean, all over the world, to be supportive, after all, of the human rights, as we had talked, how Hillary Clinton has said that gay rights are human rights, and this is something that we very much are firm believers of that. And so we will do whatever we can. And, if there are any manifestations or any events or, like this event today, where we can make a contribution, where we can be of help, we'll certainly will be participating in that. And of course, sometimes people do approach us at the embassy, trying to get more information about, what has Mexico done, how we have done it. Because after all, I mean, I think the Indian society and the Mexican society are similar in many ways, and probably the transition that we've gone through can be something that can be, a good experience for a country like India.
It's indeed important to learn from it. I want to open it up to the audience for one question. Okay. Please address it to me, and then I'll ask someone. Yes.
Thank you, organizers, for bringing us together. Excellency, good afternoon. Welcome to our country. My question is related to the United Nations SDGs. Canada and Mexico, and for that matter, what are the other countries looking for in next 7-8 years? Thank you for listening. SDGs, United Nations. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, what about the SDGs? Could you repeat the last?
Sustainable Development Goals.
Yes.
But I did not know.
Could you repeat your question?
My apologies. I'll say again. United Nations had set up 17 sustainable goals. What is the profile or what is the vision of the nations, Canada and Mexico, in next 7 years to develop that? Thank you.
Okay, so we've got 7 years until the SDG clock runs out to meet those goals. What's the vision of Canada and Mexico on that? Perhaps.
Well, we actually have 10 years because it's the Agenda 2030, so we still have a bit more time. And countries like Mexico, we're trying to fulfill as much as we possibly can the goals that are set up in the 17 SDGs and all their subsidiary goals that are set there, which of course cover a wide range of agenda, including of course questions of human rights and inclusion and tolerance. And a country like Mexico, we're doing our part. I don't think at this point that any country in the world is up to date where we should all be. But I can tell you in the case of Mexico, we're making our best effort.
From the perspective of Canada, I think first and foremost, a commitment to linking back what we do to the SDGs, Does it line up with the goals of the SDGs and making sure that's highlighted in our own country, but also lining up in our foreign policy interests and also in our foreign aid? So making sure that, again, if we're looking at what kind of interventions are we actually funding and supporting, do they line up with the SDGs? Are they measurable? So do we have the right KPIs to actually make sure we can feed back to the SDG sort of UN body to say, our interventions funded by Canada abroad and inside our own country actually counted, and how do you count them? How do you measure impact? The other thing is engaging in international fora, and that's absolutely fundamental. Our both two countries, amongst many others, and India no doubt included, need to be active members, right? And we are. So if we understand that this is a value that is shared globally, then we make sure that we're actually at the table, that we're engaged, and that we're making sure we feed back. Sometimes our issues or our challenge is we don't necessarily know how to get the data, how to collect it, and how to report it back in an effective manner. And this is one thing, that data gap and bridging it is a real push. I think the UN is making, using the SDGs as a very good sort of target and a base to help us do so. And that, if we don't work together as a collective effort, it can't happen.
Obviously, so SOGI and LGBT-related issues are key part of SDGs. Sometimes they might be subtle, but there are important aspects of it. On that note, we are a bit pushed for time, so we have to end the panel, but I would really like to thank you both for coming and sitting with us and having a talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you.
Thank you to all our panelists.